on this computer. Alrighty, so welcome back to all as we continue our journey through the Kabbalah of the Aleph-Bet, and I hope that up until now everything's been clear to everyone. And again, if anyone has any questions, always feel free to ask. Don't be embarrassed, don't be shy. These are complicated stuff, so if you have any questions, you can always feel free to jump in at any time and ask. So I'm going to share my screen. Yeah, Adrian.
I don't understand the concept of free will and God's plan.
Okay. Related to the Aleph-Bet specifically or just generally?
Well, you have mentioned it in the class. So if we have free will, then is it fated, or do we make the difference, or what's in God's domain and what are we able to do?
In the mystery of spirituality, those two things are considered not, even though on our plane of understanding, so we see that as a contradiction, but in the spiritual realm, which is above time, which is above space, which doesn't see things linear like we do, we see everything is linear. So therefore, there's a past, there's a present, there's a future. Right, but from a purely spiritual perspective that transcends time and transcends space, those two things don't necessarily need to be exclusive. God can be all-knowing, but yet give us the ability within the many different roads that we're allowed to take, that all fall within His divine plan. We might have the choice to pick which one of those roads we want to take at various places where God gives us that crossroad. And then God's knowledge, which is above time and space, from a spiritual place, doesn't decrease the fact that we are making that decision. But the scope of it is very limited. It doesn't mean necessarily that free will means that you're completely writing your own script. Obviously, you're not writing your own script. But within that script, you are making important decisions that are going to affect your spiritual level and your spiritual destiny.
But if it affects hundreds of thousands or more people, the decisions that are made in a very bad way, then what is God's role in that?
So it can only affect anyone. People are only affected by other people's decisions to the extent that they themselves have become vulnerable to that, right? So therefore, I can only be affected by your free will if my free will my choices has made me vulnerable to that, right? If I believe that you have control over me, then that's my free will choice to believe that you're more powerful than God. So I'm vulnerable to your decision making because in my own free will, I've made myself vulnerable to that. And that can be when we're speaking about two human beings, between the two of them. So we can say that is that's that's connected to my individual free will. If we're talking about on a national level, so then we're individuals, we're families, we're communities, we're part of a country, we're part of a Jewish people. And wherever you align yourself, that's your decision to associate your fate with the collaborative free will of that group, right? So as a Jew, you're part of the Jewish people. As an American, you're an American. As part of the community that you've chosen, the congregation that you've chosen, the social circle that you've chosen, right? That's your free will, and therefore you are somewhat allowing your fate to be intertwined with theirs. Mm-hmm. But that's also your free will. Does that make sense?
It does, but things like the Holocaust or things like what's happening now with COVID and such like that, how does that play into what's meant to be and free will and God's? Well,
we don't ever fully know, we don't know that. you don't necessarily fully know which aspects of divine providence are connected to your free will and which aren't. Right? We live life assuming that everything is, but we don't know. Meaning we don't necessarily know what God's plan was for COVID, nor do we know how our free will affects that. We know that our job is to pretend at least that it's based on our free will. And therefore we have to ask ourselves, what is the message of it? And what can we do? And how can we stop it? And how can we contain it? And how do we move forward? And what can we learn from it? So we have to act as if it's our free will. And certainly there is a component of free will, but something that's so huge, obviously has certain aspects that are so much bigger than that. You know, the Holocaust is clearly something that is part of a much bigger story, to which we can only scratch the surface of. So we could say, you know what, the world had to learn a major lesson, and hopefully there's less hate in the world afterwards. And so you can say that thousands of years of hatred built up to this moment, and all of our free will decisions. But one cannot point to one man or one government and say it was his free will that caused it. I mean, something of that magnitude, right, is obviously something that's interwoven of thousands of a story of thousands of years. It's got to have been a buildup. It has to be so much interconnected to the spiritual fabric of, you know, the events that led up to that time. You know, but that something to that magnitude is certainly beyond. And also, you know, it's still the aftermath of the Holocaust is still playing out. You know, the Jewish people getting Israel, you know, the world becoming more tolerant, the Jewish life in America. So the story of the Holocaust is not over, right? It's still playing out. The aftermath is playing out, and how much in the long term will we have learned from that? So we don't know. We don't know how those stories fit in. Okay, so let me share my screen with you, and let's get back to our good old packet over here, the Kabbalah of the Hebrew alphabet. So where are we? So if we take a look now, this is again our alphabet, the diagram of our alphabet, and where we are over here is we have explored the letters Aleph through Yud. And we explained that Aleph through Yud tells us a incredible Kabbalistic story. The story is the story of the Aleph, the story of the oneness of God, the Or Ein Sof, the light of the infinite God, the ineffable light of the infinite God, that becomes concealed in the Beged, represented by the Bet Gimel Dalet, that descends down from its place of pure oneness where nothing else can stand because of the incredible magnitude and power of this light. And it descends and it garbs itself like a beged into the Dalit, into this empty void space where now we as physical beings can exist. And in the Hay we saw, and again, it's not great in this one the way you see it, but you see it even better in this diagram here, we saw how the Hay itself has that spark, that little Yud, which we said is the spark of godliness. It has it hidden within. And through these letters, through the Vav, we saw the Vav, which has numerical value 6, and we saw how that shows that now the physical world is built with the spark of God. Right? So it congeals itself. It's now there. It's present in the physical world, although we can't see it. We saw how the Zayin, which is numerical value 7, which is Shabbat, really looks like a crowned Vav, like a more extravagant Vav. Because throughout the 6 days of the week, we're bringing God into the physical world, and then on the 7th day, which is the completion of the natural order, we're taking a step back and we're allowing God to permeate all of that existence. We showed how the next letter, which is the letter Ches, is really a Vav and a Zayin together with this little rooftop, this little arrow pointing upwards, and saying that our goal is to transcend this, to be even bigger than the physical world, but to discover the miraculous, to see the metaphysical aspects of the world. The 8th day is the day of circumcision, the 8 days of Hanukkah, which are miraculous, so it's something that's even bigger than nature. Last week we saw how the letter Tes, we'll show it over here. Also, it has the aspect of the Zion over here, but then it sort of has that snake head pointing inwards. And we said how Tes is Tov, and how true completion in the world can only happen through struggle, which is represented by this little snake. It's represented by this arrow pointing inside, that even though things seem bad, you have to look in, you have to look within. We showed how on the final day of creation, after Adam and Eve sinned, God looked at the world and he saw that it was Tov Ma'od, that it was very good. And we showed how 9, the numerical value 9, is like the 9 months of pregnancy, where when the pregnancy comes to its close, it seems so traumatic, so dangerous, and yet from there, new life is born. So therefore, because of all this, we lead up to the Yud, and then the Yud itself just becomes that spiritual spark, that holy spark, the divine presence, which now just stands alone. It stands revealed. That is the story of the first 10 letters of the alphabet. And the question is, where do we go from here? So before we continue, I want to just point something out to you, and listen closely and watch closely, because this is important to get a little bit of perspective as to where we are and what's coming next. If we take a look, let me get the little pen over here. So the first letter of the alphabet is over here an Aleph, correct? The last letter of the alphabet is the letter Tav, which has a T sound. Now, the alphabet has either 22 letters or 27 letters, depending on how you look at it. Why? Because there are certain letters that have 2 different variations. For example, you see over here, the Kaf has 2 variations, because this is the way it would look at the end of the words. A Mem has 2 variations, because this is how it would look at the end of the word. The same thing with the Nun, and the same thing with the Tzadi. So there are 5 extra letters in the alphabet. I'm sorry, and the same thing with the Pei. There are 5 extra letters in the alphabet that are really just variations of other letters. So one could say that there are 22 letters of the alphabet, or one could say that there are 27 letters of the alphabet. Now, if there are 22 letters of the alphabet, where would you point to as being halfway through? So you'd say it would be the 11th. So that would be over here. That would be this Huff, would be halfway through. That would be if it was halfway through on the 22 letter scale. Now, if it was 27 letters, so where would you place the halfway mark? It would be over here, this letter Mem. Okay? So pretty much we have kind of this window over here where we're up to right now, that we have these 3 letters, and again, this is an end variation. So we're not gonna, I'm just putting this X, so you shouldn't get distracted from this, because this is just a variant of this. But over here, we're really today in this section that we're at this midpoint place within the alphabet. We're at this midpoint place. And in this midpoint, we find 3 letters, the Huff, the Lamid, and the Mem. Now, if you take the full alphabet, the 27 version, and you take a look at the first letter of the alphabet, the middle letter, which is the Mem, and the last letter, which is the Tav, it actually spells a word. Anyone know what word this spells?
Emet.
Emet. The word Emet. Emet means truth, absolute truth. So the commentaries say that what is truth? What does truth mean? How do you attain truth? Truth can only be fully understood when you see the full picture. You need to see the beginning, you need to see the middle, and you need to see the end. Wherever you are in the moment, you're always in the middle. You asked before about, when bad things happen, like, bad things happen in history. So in order to fully understand it, you need to take into consideration everything that led up until that point, everything that's going to come afterwards. Now, we don't ever know that because we're never in the full picture. You're not in the full picture of your life. You only know, maybe you know some of the past. Again, and that just depends with life, how far back it goes. But in order to really know the truth about anything, you really have to be able to see the full picture, which is why the word for truth is the first letter, the middle letter, and the last letter, just saying to show us that for truth it needs to take the entire picture into consideration. But the point over here is that we focus on the mem as sort of that middle point. Now, on the other hand, if you take a look at the 22-letter version, which puts the Huff at the middle point, that's also significant because Aleph through Yud was numerical value 1 through 10, where 10 is the culmination of the single letters, and then the double letters start, right? Because now, suddenly, we start changing to 20, and now it's not going to be 20, 21, 22, it's now 10, 20, 30, 40. So now we jump, all the letters are going to jump by tens. So Huff is going to be numerical value 20, Lamid 30, Mem 40. So the nature at this point of the alphabet changes as well, because now we go from singles to doubles. And again, that really happens by Yud, right? But you begin to see the process at Huff. So you see the nature of the alphabet starting. So we're at a very unique point in the alphabet, because we see a transition happening now. We see that we're now getting to really the middle and the next phase in the alphabet. I hope that makes sense. It's interesting. Something else to point out, just to make this point a little bit stronger. We said up until now, really from the Aleph through the Yud, so we said the way we explained it is this is really the story of God, or more accurately, the story of God's light, the Or Ein Sof represented by the Aleph, and its journey. We haven't really seen that much the nature of our journey within this world. We've seen an overall picture, the Kabbalistic story of God in the beginning, which is only manifested as an Or Ein Sof, as this ineffable light, and how it's concealed and then slowly revealed. But that's God's story. That's not yet our story. We haven't yet seen the nature of our own journey within this realm. I hope that makes sense to you. And if I'm not being clear, if you don't know what I mean, feel free to ask. But it's interesting that if you take a look, because again, we pointed out that the mem is considered the middle point in the alphabet. But if you take a look at the letter mem, where this sort of new phase begins, and you take a look at the letter tuf, which is how it ends, what does this spell? Mem tuf. Anyone know what that spells?
Dead?
Mate. The word mace. Met, which is death. Now that's very sad. It sounds very, very morbid. But I mean, death, again, you can view death as morbid, but in the Kabbalistic story, does look at our physical world as a world of death. Why? Because we are, whether you like it or not, you can be having the best life. Baruch Hashem, right? I know everyone over here, right? We have a happy group of people, and we all have meaningful days. That's why you're on this call, and we all have wonderful lives, Baruch Hashem. But the reality is that every single moment is a journey closer to, the big day. Now, as Jews, that doesn't necessarily shake us up that much, because we believe in the eternity of the soul. So this is just one stage in our much greater wild existence that's beyond our imagination. But this phase is a phase of death. From the minute that you're born, you're moving closer to death. So once again, we see something happening over here in the Hebrew alphabet that that the nature of the alphabet is changing, whereas the story that was told to us from Aleph through Yud was the highest possible story, was the story of the light of God in its journey into concealment and then back into revelation. This second part of the alphabet, from Mem to Tav, is going to tell the story of our physical struggles. And each one of these letters that we're going to see is going to tell us about that struggle. And here, in this very interesting space right here, in these three letters, we're at a transition point. Right? We're here at these three letters that mark the midpoint, depending on how you look at it, they mark the midpoint of the alphabet. They change in their nature. They go from singularity to doubles. And it's sort of this hovering, this transition place. I hope that that's clear. So what we're gonna do today is we're gonna take a close look at these three letters and see how they the letters Huff and the Lamid and the Mem, and we're going to see how they transition us from this world of the pure spiritual journey to this world, the world that is sandwiched by the Mem and the Tav, the world of our struggles in this world. And these three letters are going to be that chain that connects us from here to here, as we're going to see. Any questions just at this point? Is this somewhat clear? Again, it's hard for it to be totally clear because we haven't really explained it yet, but is it clear enough to move on?
Yes.
Very good. So let's take a look over here. And I'm going to share my screen again. Take a close look at these letters. And again, this is going to refine a little bit your Hebrew skills. But when we were in the beginning, I showed you these three letters, the Bet, the Gimel, and the Dalet, how they spell Beged. Well, we're going to play that game again. We're going to take these three letters, the Chaf, the Lamid, and the Mem, and we're going to point over here to a word which the Kabbalists tell us define the grouping of these three letters, the Chaf, the Lamid, and the Mem. Except the word that we're going to learn now is actually going to be in reverse. So it's not going to be the Chaf, Lamid, and Mem, but it's going to be in reverse, which is Mem, Lamid, Chaf. For those of you who are familiar with Mem, Lamid, Chaf, they spell Melech. Spell the word Melech. Melech means king or kingship. Now that is very, very significant and fits right into what we've been saying up until now, because as we said in the pre-Rosh Hashanah class, everything that we are trying to do, our entire journey in this world, is to reveal God's kingship, to reveal Malchut, to show that God is king of this world. And in the first story, the story from Aleph through Yud, this was about discovering the immanence of God in everything. Discovering the pintel yid, right? The little point of the yid, to see how God is in everything. He's in the activities that I do. He's with me on vacation in the beautiful scenery. Go find him. In the food that I eat, go find him. I can't find him in the food that I eat. Must be you're not eating the right food. How do I know what's the right food to eat? The Torah tells you. You got to follow those rules. You'll find God there, right? Finding God during the weekday. Finding God on Shabbat. Looking everywhere and trying to discover God in that place. So that is the story of the Aleph through Yud. When we do that, once that happens, you have now revealed God's kingship in the world. You have crowned God as king. The more, this goes back, Adrian, to your question from the beginning, and Sandy, your question, the more that you pay attention to God, the more that you will feel that God is paying attention to you. Now, God is always paying attention to you, and God is always paying attention to all of us. However, God is really, really good at the game of hide and seek. And to the point that God can make you feel like he's completely not in your life at all. Because that's just the way he rolls. If you want to see the hand of God in your life, then you need to be the one to initiate that process by saying, God, I'm going to look for you. And the more that we look to find God in our life, the more that suddenly we'll see that our journey is being tailor-made for us by God. But we always start that process. We always begin that. And once we're able to reveal the godliness in the world, that is when we are meeting the true purpose of why the world is in existence. Okay, so based on that, we understand over here now, going back to my shared screen, we understand why over here, after we get to this point of Yud, the next thing is Melech. The next thing is making that transition from the spiritual place to this physical place that we're going to be studying about by revealing God as being the Melech. Now, we have said many times that every single individual, every single person, we are created b'tselem Elokim. We are created in the image of God. So that means that there's going to be aspects of ourself. Hold on one second, I'm sorry. There's going to be aspects of ourself that are going to mirror and that are going to resemble God. Now, what I want to do right now is go to the Huff, and I want to show you something over here. Sorry, I'm going to scroll all the way down over here. This is the letter Huff. Okay, so here it is. It looks like this. It's kind of this, almost like an open parentheses type of shape. And it makes either the K or the Ch sound, depending on whether it has a dot. But let's take a look. What is the meaning of this letter Chaf? So number one, to be kafuf means to be bent. Or if I force you to do something, I'm being kofe, I'm forcing. So it's this idea of subjugation, right? Bending or forcing. But it also means a kaf, which is a spoon or the palm of a hand. This is the kaf of my hand. Or, what is this called that I wear on my head? A kippah, which is in the same thing. Why? Because it's dome, it's spoon-shaped. Right? So the idea of a kaf is a vessel for something. Right? So the idea that it's bent, when you bend something, the bending of that thing allows it to contain something else. If I wore just one of the, like this, this would not make a very, very good kippah, right? Because it wouldn't sit well on my head because it has no vessel. It needs to be bent. It's the shape of something that gives it its vessel. Now, if you take a look at what significant words are built out of the chaf, we see it has the letter keter. It's the beginning of the word keter, a crown, which also works well with this idea of kippah. So both the crown is something that's placed on the top of one's head. Both the kippah and the keter are both the things that are really at the highest point of something. So we see over here in the chaf, we see this idea that something can be a vessel. We also see it as being a crown. Now we know, and we've learned this many times in our Kabbalah class, that if we climb the ladder of our consciousness, okay, on the typical day today, right, it's 12:33 right now, I'm getting a little bit hungry, so my physical body is going to say eat, and I have my emotions, and I have my different thoughts. On a typical day, I'm operating pretty much based on my daily needs, what I need from day to day. But we know that my soul is always craving, my soul is always yearning to go higher, right? And one of the things that we're trying to do in spirituality is to access the higher parts of our soul. The highest part of the Tselem Elokim, the image of God, is called Keter, the crown. We discussed this right before we discussed the Jewish people standing at Sinai, who, when they said Nasav and Ishmael, remember what we said? We said they received crowns. So the crown is the highest part of myself. The crown is, my crown is this invisible part of my personality, which isn't hungry, which doesn't want to go on vacation, which just wants to commune with God. That's what's represented by the kippah that's sitting on the top of my head. It is at that place that I become this vessel, this kaf, the kaf like a spoon or a palm of the hand. It's this place that I'm reaching upwards to God and saying, God, I just want to bring you into my life. That's the chaf. The chaf is the keter. It's this highest part of myself. And in fact, the chaf itself, if you put, anyone know, any of you Hebrew people, if you put the kaf in the beginning of a word, so it becomes ke. So when you say ke, what does it mean when you put, if I would say, I would like to be ke Adrian, ke Sandy, what does the ke mean? Ke makes two things similar to each other. This is ke this, ze kazeh means this is like this. I want to be ke Adrian. I want to be like Adrian. Be like Mike, right? So the chaf means that one thing, when you put it as a prefix, it means one thing is resembling something else. So once again, over here, we're saying that at the deepest point of my desire, at my keter, my crown, the highest point of myself, what do I want to be like? I want to be B'Tselem Elokim. I want to resemble God. That's really, if I get into my heart of hearts, the most important part of me is to resemble God. So the chaf itself is a letter that represents yearning of two things to become similar to each other. And what is that? That is the crown of a person. The crown of a person is when I transform myself to become similar to God. So it represents that highest point, that first moment of transition from the yud, from the spiritual realm, from the realm of God, into the realm of the physical world. That first point is the kaf. The kaf bridges the beginning with what's coming next. And then, with that in mind, we move on to the Lamid. Now, the Lamid is going to really further the mission of the Kaf. What do you see that is unique about the Lamid over every single letter in the alphabet? It's the tallest. The tallest. Lamid is known by, is referred to many times in Kabbalah as the tower. The towering Lamid, because it towers over everything. And in fact, if you put a Lamid in the beginning of the word, if I wanted to say, I am going li grocery store, what is le? To. Right? Ani holech le bed. I'm going to bed. Le is a destination. But you have to know your destination. So the Lamid is the tower that looks above and says, where am I going? That's where I'm going. I'm going there. That's why it needs to be a tower, because it shows me the direction that I'm going. And you see, even in this version of the Lamid, it even has like a little looking ahead, like it's like a little, what do they call it? The periscope, or what they have coming out of the tanks. This thing looking up. It points to the direction. It tells me where to go. The word Lamid itself, not the letter, but the word Lamid comes from Lomed, to teach, to educate. Education is about teaching me what I need to know to create that vision. And one of the most profound words that begin with Lamid is Lev. Lev, like the Lev experience, which means heart. Because ultimately, it is my heart that is usually guiding me and directing me and telling me where I need to go in my life. So now we put together these two letters, the letter Chaf and the letter Lamid. And over here, what are we seeing? We're seeing the unfolding of a process. We're seeing how we're reaching up to our deepest depths, the Chaf, our Keter, the deepest part of our will represented by the Chaf, right? Our Keter, our Kippah, right? Where we emulate God, that place inside of us. And now through the Lamid, we're trying to say, okay, give me direction. I don't want to be guided through my life by anybody else. I don't want to be guided by my physical desires. I want to be guided by my Keter. I want to be guided by my deepest super consciousness, which wants only to cling to God. So the Chaf gives way to the Lamid, and now the Lamid is almost reaching up and pulling that down. That's why the Lamid goes all the way to the top and then reaches down to the bottom, saying, I want that spiritual side of myself to guide me in everything that I do in my life. Questions up until this point, about the Huff and the Lamid. So now these are so far the two different aspects that we have in the word Melech. And now we get to the letter Mem, which is the final, it's actually the first. And again, we're going to discuss in a couple of minutes why it's in reverse. We'll see why it's in reverse if you haven't figured it out until now. But over here in this chain reaction of going from the Chaf, from the Keter to the Lamid, now we get to the Mem. And again, like we said before, the Mem in a sense is really the beginning of Mace. It's the beginning of that next world, the world of Misa. The Mem is going to be the final vessel in bringing my super spiritual consciousness into the physical world. And take a look. Let me scroll back down to the Mem. I need to find a more efficient way that I don't always have to turn so many pages. Okay, now we get to the Mem. And let's take a look over here at the Mem. So at the time when I put together this booklet, I had not yet found any meaning to the word Mem. However, since then I found in different texts that point out the resemblance of the word Mem to the word Mayim, which means water. That's going to be significant, and you'll see why in a moment. But the numerical value of Mem is 40. And when we take a look at the different things in the Torah that have the aspect of 40, so the first thing that jumps out is 40 days at Sinai after they received the Torah. Right? So meaning from the time that they received the Torah until Moses was supposed to come down carrying the tablets was 40 days. We also know that they spent 40 years in the desert. So what is the significance of this 40? So we see 40 as being a transition process, a development process. When the Jewish people received the Torah at Sinai, they reached a very, very high level, this new keter, this new level, but it was only in potential. And for the 40 days of development, what they were really doing was marinating, was sitting in this spiritual discovery that just happened and making it a part of them. Right? Letting it just sit in it and let it become part of you. Because you can't just in a moment turn on a dime and get to this crazy high place and think that you could maintain it. They needed 40 days of development for it to really go into their kishkas, into their essence. Same thing when the Jewish people left Egypt. They couldn't just go from Egypt into Israel just like that. You can't go from being a slave nation to a free nation just like that. They needed development. So the 40 years in the desert was the development from going from point A to point B. And therefore they point out as well that a baby, from the point of conception until the time that you can actually detect the life force that's within a child, whether it's the brain waves or the heartbeat, I think it's the brain waves within a fetus, they say 40 days, which is why the Talmud says that you could actually pray for different aspects of the baby, like what gender the baby is going to be for the first 40 days after its conception, because that's considered the earliest part of development. So 40 represents the development from conception until that thing is considered an actual being, an actual life force. And the final relevance of 40, which also relates to water, like I said before, is that the measurement that the Torah uses for volumes of liquid, when it comes to a mikvah, which is a place of spiritual immersion for both women and for men in different contexts, a mikvah has to be 40 sa'ah. Sa'ah is the measurement that is used to measure large volumes of liquid in the Torah. So it's got to be 40. What is the significance of 40? Because again, going to the mikvah is a rebirthing process. When a convert goes to the mikvah, he or she comes out a new individual with a new soul or a renewal of the soul. When a woman goes into the mikvah and comes out of the mikvah, what she's stating is that she's now ready to conceive new life. When a man goes into the mikvah, he's saying that perhaps all of the death that he's caused to his soul through impure thoughts or impure interactions, he wants to be cleansed of that when he comes out of the mikvah. So it is a rebirth, it's a renewal. And therefore, mayim itself, which is a symbol, which is the baby is immersed in water when it's in the womb, water itself is considered birth. So therefore, the mem, and it's sounding like mayim, sounding like water, and its numerical value of 40, which is a number of birth, the number of rebirthing, is a number of going from potential to actuality. That is what mem represents. Because of that, mem is that process of formation, that process of metamorphosis, which also begins with an M sound, right? It's a great word, metamorphosis. It's the development of something. If you take a look, think about the greatest leaders of the Jewish people. Moshe Rabbeinu begins with an M. And Moshe was the one who took them from bondage to freedom. He was their leader. Or the Purim story, which was a major transition in Jewish life. The leader was Mordechai. In the Hanukkah story, it was Matisyahu, and in the final redemption, it's Mashiach, all with a mem. Because these leaders all represent this point of transition, this new birth in the Jewish people. And now we get back over here to our story of the Aleph Bet. The Huff, the Lamid, and the Mem. And what's happening is we're slowly trying to bring the godliness that's at the highest level of our consciousness, our Keter. And now we're bringing it down closer through the Lamid, which is really our vision. It's also beyond. And now the letter Mem. The letter Mem is the letter of transition. The letter Mem is going to take our higher consciousness, represented by the Chaf and the Lamid, and now bring it into our physical consciousness. Interesting, Mem also represents Moach, which is the mind. And we know that the mind could either be a slave to the body, or it could be a slave to the soul. So the letter Mem is that letter of transition, and yes, it is beginning a new process. It's beginning the process of mace. It is beginning the process of now physical development, which is in the world of Misa. It is in the world of death, but like a Melech, it's connected to the Lamid and the Chaf beforehand. The Mem is the letter that connects us to this physical world that we find ourselves in, but to our spiritual consciousness represented by the Chaf and the Lamid. It plays that role. It allows us to exist in these two worlds at once. And that's why, interestingly enough, if you were wondering beforehand, why is it written Chaf Lamid Mem? Why is it written in reverse? Why isn't this the Mem, this the Lamid, and this the Chaf? The answer is that from our perspective, right, we're not born with an awareness of our superconsciousness. Where do you exist right now? Where does we exist in this physical world? For us, in the direction that we're going in, we're even though God is going in this direction from beginning to end, but from a physical perspective, you're trying to climb the ladder, you're climbing it in this direction, you're climbing it in reverse. God's always coming down the ladder, but we're always going up the ladder. So for us, if we want to discover the malchus, the kingship that's inside of us, we're going in this direction. So it's Mem Lamed Chaf in reverse, because we're climbing from the Mem to the Lamed, to the Chaf. We're climbing up that ladder until we can access our Keter. Our whole life, we're trying to break out of the bonds of our physical existence, right? We don't want to be so obsessed with what's for lunch. We want to be obsessed with what's in store in our soul. So therefore, in that direction, we want to make sure that we're going from the Mem to the Lamed to the Chaf. And now at this point in the Aleph, this is sort of like its own little unit. At this point, once we've discovered that, now we're ready to go through the journey that's going to begin with the Nun and end with the Taf, and it's going to be a difficult journey. It's going to be a journey where every single letter is going to introduce us to a new struggle. But we know that we're always able to tap back into that highest part of ourselves that's represented by the Melech. Any questions? That's, I think, a wonderful, fascinating point. And again, I'm going to just stop the recording now, but I'm open to any questions, or if anything didn't make any sense, let me know.